Good evening. Oh, that was poor. You all, can I get another audience in here? No. Good evening. Thank you. I knew I'd wake you all up. So I'm Ed Welch. Welcome to the University of Charleston, and welcome to tonight's speaker event that we are happy to have. The university is a busy place. We brag about many things. We're bragging about innovation, and we've just found out that 70% of the semifinalists in the statewide business plan competition are from the University of Charleston, the highest number ever for any school, I think. And if you don't know, even though the Gazette's very nice and helpful to let you know that we do indeed have the best number one men's soccer team in the United States. So we're proud of that as well. So it's an active campus. And even though we like activity, we don't like noise. So if you'll take your beepers and turn those off and cell phones, we'd appreciate all that as well. Tonight's speaker and the guest at the University of Charleston is Nancy Tate. She is the immediate past executive director of the National League for Women Voters, a position she held for 15 years. She is now co-chairing the 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Commission. It's an initiative to celebrate 100 years since the passage of the 19th Amendment, which I'm sure all of you know is women's right to vote. She, prior to being at the National League of Women Voters, she held positions in several federal governmental agencies as well as with a marketing consulting firm. Her bachelor's degree is in political science from Stanford. Her master's in public administration from GW, George Washington University, for those of you who are not Washingtonians. She is here as our first ever Woodrow Wilson Visiting Fellow. This is a program in cooperation with the Council of Independent Colleges to have speakers come to colleges so that they can spend a week meeting with students, visiting classes, offering workshops and other opportunities, including this one, where you get to benefit from her expertise and hear her. And as you know, our practice is you have the opportunity to write out questions. I assume we're doing that? Yes, we are. Good. And we'll happily take those questions and pose them to our speaker after she has talked. So please welcome to Charleston, West Virginia, Nancy Tate. Something about that.
Thank you. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that nice welcome. I have been here in Charleston since yesterday. I've been, aside from getting caught in every rain burst that's occurred in the last 2 days, I'm having a lovely trip. I've gotten to see the campus and got a tour of your Capitol building, which is truly beautiful, and it's wonderful that you have a room like this where you can look at it. So I'm sure that many of you know quite a bit about elections and that many of you have voted at least once in your life. Why don't you raise your hand if you have ever voted? Yeah, I'm hoping to see lots of hands here. So I'm going to go through some of the things you probably know, but kind of dig down into some other things you might know less. So the U.S. political system, these are things I'm sure you commonly associate with the system. The political parties. Mostly people think that we have two political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, but in 2016 and in other years, there were actually 4 parties on the ballot in most states, the Libertarian Party and the Green Party. Of course, there's always the candidates, and certainly in a presidential year, the candidates get all the attention. In a presidential year, obviously, there is the presidential race, 1/3 of the Senate, every member of the House of Representatives. In many states, there's the governor's races. There's at least one house, usually, of the state legislature. And there's, of course, many local races. And all of those, many states, including Virginia, have elections almost all the time on some of those down ballot races. There's, of course, the campaigns themselves. We always hear a lot of attention, particularly at the national level, about the ins and outs of who's done what and what the strategies are. There's political advertising, of course, the endless TV ads, radio ads, and now, of course, all of the social media, the ads that the candidates run themselves and the ads that everybody else runs about them, and then everybody else is talking about the ads. And then, of course, media coverage, which covers all of those things and tries to add value by doing analyses. But there are other factors that can impact the race, any race, and the outcomes of the race. So one of those is the census, which is required by the Constitution to be conducted every 10 years, so that you can keep track of where the population has grown and changed. And one purpose of that is to redistrict the lines for members of the House of Representatives as well as for your state legislature. So every 10 years, and sometimes more often in some states, you have redistricting. And that affects, again, the U.S. House of Representatives and your state legislature. Another important component of our system is the primary system. We'll get into that in a minute. Money. Money is a big factor always. 2016 was known as the year of big money because 100 of the top donors gave $10 million each. So that's only a few people giving a lot of money. And one of the things that the League has worked on for many years is trying to increase the transparency of who gives money at a minimum, so that people know who those people are or who the organizations are. Of course, information is always an important factor. Traditionally, of course, debates are important. It's important to hear from candidates at any level when they get up and tell you directly as voters who they are and what they stand for. Media coverage, of course, is increasingly part of what you know about candidates. And again, social media, which comes at the candidates, the campaigns, from every side. But the most important factor in the end is turnout. In 2016, the U.S. does not excel in its turnout rate compared to other advanced democracies. In 2016, it was 58%. That's slightly lower than the number in 2012. In some states, the turnout rate went up, but in 19 states, it actually went down. You win an election if more people who support you turn out than support the other person. And this is true in every race with one important caveat, and that is the presidential race, which is where the Electoral College comes in, because then it matters where those people live. And if they live in the states with the larger number of electoral votes, that's what makes the difference. And of course, we did see that this year as we did in election 2000. So let's talk about the candidates for a moment. How are they impacted and what's their role in all this? Well, again, redistricting impacts them quite a bit, particularly if they're running for the House or a state seat. Redistricting is done by state legislators. That can pose a conflict of interest because they're drawing their own lines. And a lot of them can get quite creative about how they draw the lines and where they want their own districts to be. This is a situation, in our view, where the politicians are picking the voters rather than the voters picking the politicians. And those situations are commonly referred to as gerrymandering. Many of you have probably heard that term, where people draw the lines, usually in ways that protect the incumbents. So, sure, why don't you make this district safe for me? That makes my life a lot simpler. That has an impact also on the primaries, and therefore the candidates who run in the primaries. And you often find, of course, increasingly, it's the case that very few races for the U.S. House of Representatives are competitive races. Many, many districts are either heavily Republican or heavily Democratic, and the candidate from that party tends to win. As a result, a lot of times the real election is going on in the primary. people challenging Democrats from the left, people challenging Republicans from the right. And so when you're a candidate, you have to figure out where you are on that spectrum. Gender is another important characteristic. There are obviously more women in office and running for office over the years than there had been in the past, but it is still the case there is no level of government where women are at 50% of the elected officials, even though, of course, they are 50% of the population. Money, again, is a really big issue for candidates. They spend a considerable amount of time raising money. Members of the House and the Senate will even tell you how much they resent that they really have to spend a lot of time. A lot of that money goes into their advertising on television and so forth. Information, again, is something they have to deal with. They need to participate in debates. A lot of times, frankly, incumbents don't really want to participate in debates because people have heard of them, nobody's heard of their challenger, so much the better, you know? Well, why give them the visibility? The media covers them, they run their own ads, they do their own work on social media. And again, they've really got to work on turnout. They've got to get their supporters out. But shifting over to the election system as from an institutional point of view, this is one of the ways in which we are most different from other advanced democracies, and that is that our system is heavily decentralized. There's a very small role for the federal government in terms of what rules are set or procedures. There are only two small federal agencies, the Federal Election Commission that mostly deals with the candidates' money. They have to report how much they gathered and spent. More recently, there's been the Election Assistance Commission, which tries to provide tips mostly and advice to state boards of elections and help them with technology in particular. And then both President Obama and now President Trump have created presidential commissions to look at different aspects of improving the election system. But mostly election laws and operations are decided at the state level, and that is a power given to them in the Constitution. A lot of the implementing details, however, are done at the local level. That's where elections take place, typically in the counties. Many counties are not well funded in general, and in the pecking order of issues that they face, elections are usually towards the bottom. They've got the schools and the roads and so forth. So you have a decentralized system, and that leads to a lot of differences between counties, even within the state, and certainly between the states. So here are some of the areas where you particularly see differences between the states. One is on voter registration. So this is the issue of who can vote. And this is essential because if you are not registered to vote in the United States, you cannot vote. You must be registered. So states vary, though, on what type of documentation they require so that you are able to register to vote. So documentation is usually getting at addressing two issues. Are you who you say you are? And two, are you in the right jurisdiction? So that doesn't matter for president, but it matters for city council or school board or state assembly seat. Another issue where the states vary is who can actually register you. The two parties can always register people to vote, but there's a lot of other nonpartisan groups who over the years try to register people to vote. And some states have stiffened the laws considerably to eliminate some of those groups. There's a whole other set of issues about the maintenance of the voter registration lists, because obviously people move, they die. How do you keep the list up to date? How long do you have to wait to decide if somebody's ever coming back to your state or your jurisdiction? And some states, and this is a situation that can impact students negatively, because depending on the rules, if they decide, if a state election official decides that, well, here's somebody who didn't vote in one election cycle, well, I guess they moved, they take them off the rolls. Well, maybe they just didn't vote that time, and then that person isn't in the system anymore. So there's a lot of different rules and sort of in the mechanics of maintaining the statewide registration lists. States also vary in terms of early voting, which is a sort of a broader definition than absentee voting. I live in Virginia, and in Virginia, even if you can go in person to vote early, you always have to have a reason. You have to actually check off a reason on the form about why you cannot come on election day. Other states just let you apply to permanently vote absentee. My mother lived in California. She was elderly, and they always sent her an absentee ballot. So it varies again about whether they make that part easy or not. There's also a lot of differences on election day. So a lot of different machines. I've looked at some information from West Virginia. I believe there are 4 different types of machines that are used in different places in the state. States vary in terms of how they design the ballot. Those of you who were around for election 2000 know that the design of the ballots in Broward County in Florida made a huge amount of difference in terms of whether voters understood them and whether they marked them correctly. The length of the ballot can make a difference. You all here in West Virginia elect judges. Many states do not. A lot of times that or ballot initiatives makes the ballot very long. A lot of people go, oh, I don't know, we just skip that part. So there's a lot of variation. How many polling places there are in a precinct varies quite a bit, and whether there's state guidance on that. And where those polling places are located matters. Are they convenient to where the population is or not? And also how many poll workers there are and the degree of training that poll workers have. So moving on to voters, who is eligible to be a voter? Well, you must be 18, you must be a citizen, you must be a resident of the jurisdiction in which you are casting the ballot. Whether or not if you are an ex-felon, however, it varies by state when and if you can vote. So some states actually restore your voting rights as soon as you've completed your sentence. Other states, you have a number of years to wait and you have to personally petition the governor. So again, you find a lot of variation, and some of these changes impact people in ways they don't expect. Who is underrepresented, therefore? And these are the categories of people. Young people, defined as ages 18 to 25, especially non-college students, people of lower economic status, people of color, and overseas voters, including the military. There really are a lot of other overseas voters, business people or so forth, who are stationed overseas, but a lot of these laws make it difficult to get the ballot to them, and certainly this is true for armed forces personnel who are in a battlefield. A lot of times they can't get the ballot and send it back in time to meet the deadlines. So what is it that when you ask voters, what do voters think are the most important questions they have to have answered? And one of them is, am I registered to vote? And as I said, this is a critically important question because you must be registered to vote, and you must be registered, you will need to re-register every time you move. So if you have a different address, especially even if it's down the street, you need to re-register. And a lot of people don't know that, and therefore people who move around a lot, like students, probably particularly don't know that, and they think they've registered, but actually they're not. So most state secretaries of state websites have a way that you can go online and put in your information and find that out, but you need to know to do that. Another question that's important for voters and that they do ask is, where do I go to vote? And this sounds surprising, but 50% of the calls that go to election hotlines on election day are people asking, where is my polling place? So these are people who are registered, they want to vote, they're planning to vote, but actually they don't know where to vote. And if you go to the wrong polling place and you did it at the end of the day and you can't get to the right polling place, you're disenfranchised. So it's a very important, here's a basic logistical detail that's important to know. And of course you need to know what's on the ballot. Who are the candidates? What are the ballot initiatives if you're in a ballot initiative state? And in some states, they put constitutional amendments on there. And a lot of times, if people haven't paid attention, they think there's only a few candidates, and here are all these questions, and of course, they don't know what to do, and you don't get a good representative response then to these questions. So, young voters. So, in the 2016 election cycle, there were 46 million eligible young voters, and again, in these ages 18 to 25. They need to decide where are they going to register, and this is particularly true if you are a student. Are you going to register here if you're going to school here and you're living in Charleston, or are you going to register and you're going to vote at where your parents live? And those decisions drive a lot of other things that you need to investigate. If you're going to vote at home, wherever home is, you either have to go home and vote on election day there, or you have to vote absentee. And to do that, you need to know what the procedures are for voting absentee. When can I get it? When does it have to be returned? What do I have to do to prove that I'm who I say I am when I'm doing it? If you're going to vote here or any place where you're voting in person, again, you need to know your polling place. You need to know what kind of identification you need to bring to the polls. And this varies by state, again, as I said. In some states, a student identification, or especially if you have a student identification with your picture on it, counts, but in other states it does not count. And of course, you need to know the poll hours. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, so that means there are elections going on in Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia, and they have different polling hours. So if you're not paying attention and you think the polls close at 7:30, but really they closed at 6:30, too bad for you. You know, there are no makeup days on elections. There are no extending the hours. They will, if you are in line, they will not shut the door until everybody in line is in, but if you come after the polls are closed, you know, you're out. So, of course, it's important for young voters to also, of course, be informed about the candidates and the issues, to turn out to vote. They only voted at a 50% rate in 2016. That presidential years are higher than in other years. Sometimes it's only as low as 25% of the youth vote turning out in the congressional years, let's say, of 2014 or next year in 2018. So that makes a big difference. It's important for young people, of course, so for you young people who are here, it's important for you who are involved to talk it up with your friends. Use social media. These are probably not even the best social media channels. I don't even know of all the ones that you all might use, but spread the word. And of course, ideally, you keep staying informed and engaged, because the election is just the first part. A lot of these candidates you're going to see again either in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, and it's important to know something about what they did or what the government of which they were a part did. So you're not at tabula rasa every time. So what's the overall impact, particularly of all these different laws and all of these different aspects of our system? Well, the fact is that voters can be disenfranchised. And it could happen through several different means. One is election laws and procedures, some of the things I've talked about. Sometimes this is unintentional. People didn't realize they put the polling place too far away or whatever. Sometimes it is intentional that certain populations are discouraged from voting. But as a person, you can end up disenfranchising yourself if you don't know the rules, if you miss the registration deadlines, if you didn't know how to handle an absentee ballot, if you went to the wrong polling place. That's on you. And in our system, it is on the voter to learn these things themselves. So that's why you have a lot of groups like the League, the Secretaries of State, trying to get out information, but you need to find it. If there are problems at the polling place, and sometimes there are, sometimes, of course, a machine doesn't function, but the most common problem that's a real barrier is long lines. A lot of times, the lines are so long, and people who need to go on to work or pick up the kids from school or get back to class cannot afford to stand there for 4 hours. And so if they leave and they don't get back before the polls close, they are disenfranchised. One of the reasons you can have long lines is that you don't have enough machines. And this is where the local election officials at the county level have to try to guess in advance how many machines they need in each of these different polling locations. Another problem can be if you don't have enough poll workers, or the poll workers are confused about the rules. So those are all their own problems, but they always make the lines longer. And then there's also the issue of dirty tricks. So off and on through many years of U.S. elections, somebody has tried to pull some dirty tricks. And traditionally, that's been that the opposition party or an opposition candidate tries to confuse people on the other side, and they put up posters and say, oh, the election has been postponed to another day, or this polling place is closed, go 10 miles down the road, or so forth. So that's happened, but the numbers are usually small and they don't usually have any significant impact. Well, this last year, we've heard a lot about hacking. So I'm going to talk about it a little bit now, and if people want to talk about this more, we can come back to it later. But what we saw was hacking in several different senses. So one was the hacking of emails to release embarrassing information. And we know there suddenly became, at different points in time, a lot of embarrassing information coming out of some of the Democratic campaign committee. Whether that impacted the vote or not is unclear, but it was clear that, they did not want that to happen. A separate issue is the hacking of election results, actually changing the vote. There is no indication that that happened. There is an indication that the Russians tried to attack about 21 of the state election websites, but they did not get through. And in fact, it would be very hard under at least the electronic system we have today, it would be very hard to hack things and change national results or even statewide results because, as I mentioned, the systems are very decentralized. There is no national database of all the voters and all their, so you can't go to the internet and hit something and hit the whole country. You would have to go in, know key precincts in key states, and that seemed like they could go either way and be able to identify those and their machines and their software and become very specific. You'd also have to do it in a way that was subtle enough that it wouldn't be obvious to the election observers that suddenly a county that usually voted one way, suddenly it's all voting the other way. Well, that's odd. They do have observers. They do have, both parties usually have observers at the polling places. And most election officials and election offices that I know of are very conscious of security in all of the lead up to the election. In other words, they lock up all the ballots that are given, they lock up the machines, they have processes with members of the party watching them so that nobody can say that somebody tried to pull something over on them. So at least with the technology and the setup we have now, it would be difficult to do. In a local race where there's fewer people and it's easier to target, it might be possible, but so far we have no indication of that. However, if we can have cars where no people drive them anymore, I guess one day we could have, somebody will come up with some other electronic system, but in fact some of the states worrying about this are changing their technology and moving away from the touch screen, fully electronic machines to the same kind of setup that students use when they're taking the SAT test. And that is, it's actually on paper, you fill in little bubbles, and then they read them into a scanner so that they're read electronically, but there's actually a paper record. So if by the time all the polling place officials have to reconcile at the end of the day if, gosh, this is odd, all of these votes are going like this, or they send it to the state and they've got the record, you have an ability to check and do a recount. So in the state of Virginia, the legislature has just passed a law that everybody must use those kind of machines this year. They had been evolving to that, but they actually, because this is a big election year in Virginia, the governor's race and the legislature. Of course, another type of outside meddling that you could call dirty tricks was what I'll refer to as the social media targeting. And this is what we're starting to see more about, where Facebook and some of these other sites, apparently unbeknownst to them, had on them lots of advertisements that they're saying, you know, were really posted by some of the Russian groups and targeting very subsets of the population, often with what was either nasty or misleading information. So how does the League of Women Voters fit into all this? Well, we're a grassroots organization, we're a membership organization, and we operate at the 3 levels that our federal system of government operates at. So I was with the National League of Women Voters. There's a state league in every state, and there are 700 roughly local leagues. 4 of them are here. There is a state league in West Virginia, and there are 4 local leagues. The main purpose or the main functions of the league are to undertake education and advocacy on many issues. So by education, there's a lot of issues, a lot of the things I've just talked about today, about how the election process works, who the candidates are, all of the traditional things you might assume that we work on, and in fact we do. We also try to put on a lot of forums, settings like this, on other public policy issues, but primarily it is on election issues. We also do advocacy, so that's just to give the voters information for them to use as they see fit. Same time, we do try to work on reforms in the election systems to minimize the barriers so that where there are problems there, those can be overcome. In doing that, we are actually a citizens organization. We were founded as a women's organization. We were founded by the suffragists. We were created in the same year that the 19th Amendment passed. Our original charge was to help educate the millions of women who, of course, had never voted and never thought they were going to vote, and help them with the issues, as well as continue to work on issues that affected women and children. But after 50 years, we sort of realized that the men weren't that informed about the issues either. So we I don't want to say we lowered our standards, I'll just say we changed them. And we do have men members. So as I tell other people, we're not limited to voting, because we work on other issues, and we're not limited to women. But it's a great brand name, and we're sticking with it. We're also nonpartisan, and we found in some of our surveys that very few people in today's age really know what that term means. It means that we do not support or oppose any candidate or political party. We do not do that. However, it does not mean we do not take positions. We do take positions through a process engaging our larger membership, and we do advocate sometimes at the national level and also at the state and local levels on those issues. As it was mentioned in the introduction, now that I am no longer the CEO at the League, I have moved over into this capacity to help work with other organizations to celebrate and commemorate the 100th anniversary of women winning the vote. The League is the only existing successor organization to the suffragists. So there's a lot of history here, and some of the students in some of the political science classes are going to hear more about this tomorrow, but I'll only go into that if some of you have questions. So to just briefly give you a little bit more detail about the kind of help that the League provides specifically for voters. From the national level, we have a national one-stop shop election website called vote411.org. Each year, we try to set up different partnerships to get out the word to different populations. Last year in 2016, we had a Use Your Voice tour, partnering with singers Patty Griffin and Sarah Watkins, and at their concerts, they would talk about voting and registering, and League members would be there to register folks. In past years, we had a partnership with World Wrestling Entertainment, and we had the Smackdown Your Vote program. And as the wrestlers would go around the country and fact, they don't call themselves the wrestlers or the athletes. They call themselves the talent. So when the talent went to different cities and had matches or meets or whatever, league members were there actually to register people to vote before they went in. At the local level, again, it's at the local level where elections occur. Local leagues do voter registration. They put out voter guides, sometimes with newspapers, sometimes on printed pamphlets, and increasingly now they use our Vote 411 website and put their candidate information in this national database. It's not only candidates, by the way, it's oftentimes the ballot initiatives and trying to explain what some of these initiatives are that are on the ballots. The leagues put on forums and debates. Some of you may know that the league back in the 80s did sponsor the presidential debates, but no longer, mostly because the two parties did not want us to. That's a whole nother story. And the league members work with local election officials to help them figure out where are the best places to put the polling places, how many machines, just sort of operational issues. Vote 411, the site that I mentioned, has, because there are so many different laws in different states, and anybody who moves around thinks that they know, longtime voters think that they know, you move to a new place, or the law changes in your own state, you're like a first-time voter again. So Vote 411 has all the laws, election-related laws, in every state. It has a national polling place lookup. As I mentioned, where is my polling place, is just an incredibly common question, and one that we try to solve by working with groups that collect that data and putting it in one place. Some of the Latino voter groups that we work with take calls from people in Spanish, and then they use Vote for One, look up their address, and explain it to the people in Spanish. We also have What's on Your Ballot. So again, you can see we cover all the races down through State House, who's on it, and if there are ballot initiatives. We have a registration tool in both English and Spanish. And in 2016, we served 4.5 million Americans with the Vote 411 site. As I said before, in addition to helping the voters, we do try to improve election processes. Our overall goal is free, fair, and accessible elections. That means both in the registration process and in the actual voting process. So we do a lot of focusing on improvements, particularly in registration. We do fight things that we consider to be restrictive voter identification laws, restrictions on whether the league or other like groups can register people to vote. We worry about some of the undue purges of these lists and kicking people off before they've been given notice. And we fight against unduly limiting the opportunities for early voting. We do work on proactive reforms, such as online registration. Most states have moved to online registration now. West Virginia does have that. Increasingly, we're also urging states to have same-day registration, which is a process where you can register on election day, because a lot of people don't even think about the election until election day, and then you vote, and but your ballot is not counted until they verify that the information you gave when you registered was correct. So there are some positive things as well as less positive. So why is the League committed to all this? As I said, we come out of the suffrage struggle and what it took to just get the right to vote. We see that there are many individuals and many populations of people who are still not voting or for whom it is hard to vote. We feel that voting is both a right and a responsibility that should not be taken lightly, and we want to do what we can to make it easier for voters and for the system to work in the best way possible. So in conclusion, as you can imagine, I would say this, elections are important. Your voice needs to be heard. Everyone's voice needs to be heard. The outcome, and I'm sort of talking partly to the students here, the outcomes affect your life now, and they're going to affect your future, sometimes in ways you can't even predict. Better understanding the election system and these procedures are important because these are the sort of behind the scenes, seemingly insignificant administrative decisions that can actually change a lot, and it's not as obvious to the naked eye. Staying engaged is obviously important. And finally, who can vote? And that means who is actually eligible and who is actually registered and who actually does vote. Turnout are always the most important issues, and we all need to pay attention to that in every election cycle. So thank you for inviting me to share this information with you, and I look forward to your questions.
So write out questions, this one? Yes, no? Yeah. So write out questions, pass them to one of the side aisles or the middle aisle, probably better. They'll pick them up, they'll censor the ones I don't like, and I ask the others. So, help me to ask some specific questions of Nancy. She's done a wonderful job of laying out the big picture about where we are. But it wasn't until you got to that next to the last slide that I said, okay, that's getting a little more interesting. So I get the opportunity to ask you a couple of questions while they are collecting. So the first one would be, there's as much conversation now as I've heard over the years about making changes in election laws and processes. It seems to be one of the buzzwords or thoughts. What is one proposal that you've heard for changing election laws that you find most objectionable?
It's a hard question because there are so many little things that can be done, and they vary by the states. But as a generic category, the biggest one is putting onerous requirements about the identification that you need to show. So for instance, all right, I've explained you have to have identification to show who you are and where you live. For many states, for the where you live, you could show your utility bill. Some of the states, as you keep going farther, well, it has to be a photo ID. Okay, a photo ID. Okay, it has to be a government-issued photo ID. Well, okay, well, it's a driver's license. Well, a large number of people actually do not have driver's licenses. A lot of people who live in the cities and don't drive don't have one. A lot of the elderly people don't have one. So, okay, what other kind of government-issued photo ID can you have? Some states automatically do give older people a card when they're no longer voting, but some states don't. Some states would actually have to create a whole new system to just deal with that. Some of the states have gone even beyond that and saying you have to prove all of that, you need to bring your birth certificate. Well, this is particularly discriminatory against women because particularly married women who now have a different last name than what was on their birth certificate. And what if you were born in a different state or you were married in a different state? You've got to write back to those other states and get that documentation. I mean, this is a lot of trouble that for a problem that doesn't really exist. So if I had to pick one category, I would pick the various requirements that have been added in some states about voter identification.
Okay, let me flip that then and ask you, is there or what proposal out there to change election laws do you find would be helpful, that you would like to see happen? Or election laws or practices? Right.
Well, one reform that's gathering momentum in a number of states is what they're calling automatic registration. So instead of saying that you have to go to all these extra steps to be registered, you make it much easier to register. So that's already sort of the notion behind the motor voter law, which means that you can register to vote when you get your driver's license. And so there's some of the states are increasing the opportunities that we'll just assume you're registered. You still have to show identification, but instead of you having to seek out the place to go to be registered, the system itself presents you with that, makes it much more automatic. That reduces some of the burden that's on the voter to find all that information out.
Is it the goal of the League to have women make up 50% of the government to create equal representation in the U.S.?
Well, we could never hope for anything as wonderful as that. No, that's not our goal.
I thought you were going for 70. I didn't know.
We don't really, as I say, we don't support candidates. So even if there's women in a race, we don't tell anybody to support women, men, or anything else. So we don't have any goal. We do think that the elected representatives in this country should look more like America. So since 50% of the population are women, it would be a lot better if more than 25% of the elected officials were women. But, of course, we're not saying that nobody else, that the men shouldn't have a say too. So we're happy to let them have a say.
Voter apathy is a serious problem. What can we do to get more people to vote?
Well, that's a hard question, and that's something the League has been working on for years. And one of the things when I'm in some of these classrooms, I ask the students, because it's some of these younger groups that are not registering or voting in their percentage of the population, what would it take to get them more engaged? And I'm not even sure at this point if it's apathy so much or people just tuning out. So it's sort of a negative reaction as opposed to not caring at all. They don't like any of the candidates, or they think the candidates are just alike and it's not going to make any difference, or they don't talk about anything that I care about. And all of those things are said, and those are different problems, and they're hard to address. So that's why we give speeches like this. It is important. These decisions make a difference in real people's lives. They make a difference in the people you and the people you know. But a lot of people just are not, of course, everybody's busy. They've got full lives. They can't always spend the time to understand it. I think it would be helpful if, both in the schools and in our political discourse, if we could reinforce this value probably better than we've been doing.
This questioner says that Australia and maybe other countries mandate voting. I didn't know that, but I accept that. Do you think it would be good for us in the U.S. to mandate voting?
That is never going to happen. We have a system that is, that just goes, I know there are several countries that do that. Excuse me, that goes against the core of so many American values that even working towards that aim would be very difficult. We believe in freedom of choice. We believe that if you don't feel like voting, you don't have to. And that's great, except that it does lead to the fact that you have, when people don't want to, and there's too many of them, their voices aren't being heard and decisions are being made by too few. So certainly the League is not advocating for that. Like anything else, when you force people to do this, I know in Peru, for instance, you are required to vote. And when you do vote, you get some kind of a stamp on your sort of citizenship card. And, okay, they don't care until you go to get a driver's license or until you go to do something else with the government, and then they see that you didn't do it. Then you have penalties. I just can't see us in this country going down any kind of enforcement path to make people vote.
How much influence do you believe that national newscasters have on election outcomes? Are they fair and unbiased, or are they so interested in viewership that they focus on getting comments and outrageous behavior and the like?
Well, there's probably a lot of answers to that question. For one thing, I think national newscasters get a lot fewer eyes now than they did in the past, and they don't have the same amount of influence that they had in previous generations. I can't, some people it's more obvious than others that they do seem to be biased. Some of the channels, some of the networks are kind of identified with that. I think other people aren't trying not to be biased, but people may perceive them that way. I honestly think one of the problems with a lot of the news forecasters is that they focus too much on the horse race. You know, they're always talking about, oh, the inside fighting in the campaign and what so-and-so said and this advisor is out, and not enough time on the issues or how somebody's suggested platform affects the issues. And you just totally lose what the whole thing is about for all of this static about the who shot John and how they did at the last rally and all that sort of thing. I think if they could spend less time on that, we'd have a big improvement.
Okay. This person wants you to discuss the effect, if any, of fact-checking organizations. And so I can use that and report that with PolitiFact has now signed an agreement with West Virginia and working with the Charleston Gazette-Mail. So they're going to fact-check West Virginia elections for the next year. And that'll be interesting to see. So that's one example of those fact-checking organizations. What effect do they have on elections?
Well, probably not as big an effect as they should have. I mean, we're a big supporter of that. We're a supporter of facts and people getting the facts, and then, of course, if that involves people checking to see if other people are using the facts, that's better. But a lot of the ones are where they report whether somebody was using facts or not are in places where, you know, a lot of people in the public don't go to see it, so they don't know it. And then we have a column in the Washington Post in the D.C. area, but unless you're reading that part of the Washington Post, you don't see the analysis of what was correct or not. The League a couple of years ago tried to work with TV stations, and under some of the Federal Trade Commission laws about where you're supposed to have fairness, there are different standards about where they're supposed to be assuring that even when they run any kind of an ad for a ketchup bottle or for a candidate, that they're in essence saying that this is basically factual. Increasingly, there are so many ads that are run by groups other than the candidates, and the TV stations get most of their money. They get a huge amount of money when these campaign ads are run that they just don't get around to checking. So we were trying to put pressure on the networks and the TV stations to check before they ran the ad, or at least be more clear whose ad it was. And, you know, we met with mixed results. So we think it's a wonderful thing to do. I'm really glad to hear that. I'm afraid that a lot of times it doesn't have as much effect as we would like.
Someone wants you to explain the origin of the terms left and right. Do you know their origin?
I don't really. I mean, I could guess, but I'm sure somebody here, one of the scholars in the group or the political scientists, I see some of the professors I know, maybe they know. I don't really know.
Everybody's shaking their heads going, I'm looking. Brad, Kara?
I want to say it had to do with something that happened in the French Parliament post-French Revolution, and you had the left and the right on that. But that's me just spouting something off the top of my head. I have to go back and Google it and find out if it's wrong.
So would the person who asked that question talk with Brad and have him get your email and he can send you the answer?
So next time when you're in Paris and you see the left bank and the right bank, you know it goes back to the revolution. So it's a good thing. What practices disproportionately and negatively impact underrepresented voters? You talked about the photographs and the ID. Are there some other practices that disenfranchise people who are already underrepresented?
Almost all the ones I mentioned. I mentioned them because those are the ones we know for sure. The ID, the maintenance of the lists, where you can go to be registered, who can do it. More people of color are registered by third-party groups than white people. So if you put limitations on third-party groups, third-party meaning they're not one of the two political parties, then you are limiting the access that population has to getting voter registration information. There's a lot of ways, you know, if you put the polling places, we found in a number of small college towns that the residents of the town don't really want the students to vote there, and not because they probably care whether they vote for president, they don't want them to vote on local tax issues. So they put the polling place locations at a rather inconvenient distance from the campus, so that you'd have to take 3 buses or something to get there. That works against the students. So there's a lot of these sort of, seemingly on the face of it, not that bad, but collectively, a lot of these things hit the same population, people that move around a lot, whether because they're looking for jobs or they're changing jobs in college and so forth. It's documented. I mean, I'm not just saying this because I think this might be true. It is true that some populations are impacted more than others by these specific kinds of laws.
It was a couple of years ago, Vic, the city folks in Charleston wanted University of Charleston students to sign up and change their residence, partly because we were trying to make sure the population would stay above 50,000, so we'd be eligible for some funds. So Charleston was very welcoming to University of Charleston students, and probably still is. Somebody noted that the West Virginia State Senate has 33 members, of whom 3 are females, and that prior to 2016 it was 32-1, and wanted to know if you had any comment about our representation in the West Virginia State Senate.
Well, as you heard, my view is more women are better, and not inherently because they're women, but because they do have different perspectives. They do represent a large segment of the population. So from that point of view, it's going in the wrong direction to have an election where you end up with fewer. I don't know the specifics of West Virginia, so that's probably all I can say about it.
Can you talk about how some election processes might be affected by the outcome of cases before the United States Supreme Court?
Well, there's always cases before the court, but the one they might be referring to is a redistricting case concerning the state of Wisconsin. So redistricting is one of these issues that it's hard for the Supreme Court to get its handle on, because the process of setting the districts is per the Constitution, a state function. But they have determined over time that when you redistrict in ways that are particularly aimed at minimizing racial minorities, that is discrimination, it's violating civil rights laws and so forth, and so they will disallow redistricting when they can see that that's the impact. What we have now in the case of Wisconsin is not that. It's a case where it's so obvious that the Republican legislature has drawn districts that disproportionately favor the Republican legislature. So in other words, I forget the numbers, but something like, in terms of in-state voting, let's say 48% of the people voted Republican, but 60% of their representatives are now Republicans because of the way the boundaries are written. So the case involves trying to get the Supreme Court to say, well, this is not the criterion you usually use, but it's so clear in this particular case, based on whatever the data is that they have, that we really think that at some point here, the court should really try to set some boundaries on how far these districts can be manipulated for partisan purposes. So this will be a very influential case. It's been argued, but they won't decide for many months. This would be a real victory for people who are concerned about redistricting. It will be a setback if they decide, well, this is not something the Supreme Court can decide on, every state's on their own, because it encourages whoever it is, it's not always the Republicans, whoever it is, to have the power to keep ensuring their power by moving these lines around.
For a number of years, since 2000, you have observed presidential elections and other elections. From those observations, can you share an anecdote or two about the strategies and the games that the parties played in order to get the best opportunity with regard to debates, or to get the best opportunity with regard to getting their names before the voters?
Wow. Well, let's see. It was an interesting 15 years, as I will say. I started 3 weeks before election 2000, and of course, election 2000 was just going to be your average kind of presidential election. As on election day, we don't have a winner, and we went through this very unusual process. And I was telling him earlier that I had only been there 3 weeks. I really didn't know. I was not an election specialist when I got there. I didn't know what the league's position was on the Electoral College, and the Electoral College was obviously the key element in a lot of those decisions. And a news team came to my house that night, and I had to call my staff at home and say, what's our position? What's our position? Geez, I don't know.
What happened in 2000?
That was,
there's some people that maybe weren't born then.
yeah.
Sorry.
So in 2000, we had a more confusing version of what we've just had here, where in that case it was the state of Florida, where there were so many ballots that were either missing or mismarked. And it made a difference then whether the state of Florida's electoral college votes went for Mr. Bush or Mr. Gore. And they couldn't figure it out. But it was all about it was about the ballots, but then ultimately the electoral college. So in fact, the League of Women Voters was one of the only groups who was already on the record about our organization's views about the electoral college, which was that we were opposed the electoral college. This was decided by the members many years before that, and we were the only group who had that position that wasn't based on whether you supported Mr. Gore, or Mr. Bush. That's sort of an amusing anecdote for me because my 2 kids and the beagle were over on the couch, as you're watching the crew set up. But it doesn't get to the larger issue of how people manage these elections and the edge that they try to get. A lot of times, but I did share with you an example. Sometimes, and we've certainly seen it this year, going on attack, even when you're wrong, is often perceived to be the best strategy. So in 2008, during President Obama, running against John McCain, it came to the period of the debates. And even though the League of Women Voters has not run the presidential debate since 1988, a lot of people seem to think that we do. And the moderator for the vice presidential debate was Gwen Ifill. And there became circulating a rumor in some of the conservative commentaries that because of that, because she was African American, she was going to be incredibly unfair to Sarah Palin, who was the Republican nominee for vice president. And they absolutely slammed the leagues, all of our phone lines, all of our website addresses, all of our emails, demanding that we take Gwen Ifill down as the moderator. We don't do the debates. So, it was a bogus question, and they went to the wrong group. So everything about it was wrong, but it got the people who cared about that, who believed that maybe she would be treated unfairly. It made them feel good that they were taking action. It wasted a lot of our time where we were trying to get out voter information and so forth. And it's just sort of many things like that happen every time, and it's unpredictable. Something is a flash issue, and we saw that this last time. Something excites somebody, and then between the press and everybody else, you run around and get real worked up about it, and then, if that's gone, you're on to some other crisis. And it doesn't lend to an orderly thinking through who you want to represent you.
Well, you don't run the debates, but the league's representatives are always introduced and mentioned. So people get the appearance that you're heavily involved. What is the involvement?
We have no involvement in the presidential debates. We are the group that frequently conducts statewide debates and local debates. So a lot of the states, the governor's debates, the Senate, local races. I am on the board of my local league in Arlington, Virginia. We just did a candidate forum last week for county council and school board. So it's a well-known thing that we do, and we do it, and a lot of people ask us to take back the debates because they're always put off by some of the questions that get asked, and then sometimes the ridiculous answers, or the fact that the candidates often do not answer the question. But in fact, you cannot take back the debates if the candidates won't come to your debate. So the Commission on Presidential Debates is managed by a steering committee and it's chaired by representatives of the two main parties. And so they like to have their own rules, and they're not going to let them come to any of our debates. They already determined that in 1988.
As you look ahead, where do you think the electoral process is going, particularly at the national level? The last election had as many examples of personal attacks as we've seen in a while, and now calls for changes in some of the rules and the like. What's your forecast about what's going to happen, and maybe a couple of changes we might expect to see happen in voting in the United States in the future?
Well, probably in terms of the quality of the public conversation or the way the candidates talk, I'm guessing, I hope I'm wrong, but I'm guessing it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think at some point, as some of the things that have been said either turn out not to be true or to not be quite as terrible or whatever, or people just get tired. I mean, sometimes you just get tired of the candidates, especially when one party's been in office for 8 years. Okay, you're kind of ready for the next group. So, but that takes a bit of a cycle. So in terms of the hostility and the animosity, I'm guessing that maybe in this next cycle, 2018, we might see more of that. But at some point, I think it will start to turn. It's harder to say whether turnout will go up or go down as a result of that. You have a lot of people who are furious about the results of 2016, and you have other people who are obviously very supportive, and you probably have people in the middle who are just discouraged that something, which always happens, something that a candidate promised doesn't turn out. Maybe those people will stay home. That would be the worst thing, really, but it wouldn't be unexpected, and especially if a lot of things have been promised and they don't happen, you can understand where people would be discouraged and say, what the hey, maybe I don't want to participate anymore, and that would be very bad for all of us. So I'm hoping that that's not true. One thing you can say about this election was there was a lot of energy. So either that energy will keep on going, and it might be negative energy, but it will get people out there doing the things they think they need to do. That would probably be better than everybody just giving up in discouragement.
Thank you all for coming. Thank Nancy for answering questions and presenting to us. And have a great evening.